Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something a little different today, spoken English fluency. We got a lot of requests to break down this article from the EF Go blog. It's called How to Speak English Fluently, 10 Key Steps.
Yeah, this one should be fun.
Definitely. So we'll pull out some tips, see what insights we can find that maybe aren't so obvious. Stuff that can actually help people feel more confident and natural when they speak English.
Because, so many people think fluency is like this impossible dream, right? But this article really challenges that.
Totally. It starts off by saying that fluency isn't about perfect grammar or sounding exactly like a native speaker.
All right.
It's more about, like, being able to express yourself comfortably,
Mm-hmm.
you know, getting your ideas across.
Yeah, and I think that's such a crucial point. It's about connection, right? Like, language is about connecting with other people. And sometimes I think focusing too much on, like, textbook perfection can actually get in the way of that.
For sure. Okay, so the article jumps into idioms and slang pretty quickly. It says those are really important for sounding natural. But it kind of throws you in the deep end there.
Yeah.
Like, maybe we should back up a second.
Yeah. Oh.
What are idioms, and why do they matter so much for spoken fluency?
Right. So idioms are like those expressions where the meaning isn't obvious just from looking at the individual words. Like, take kick the bucket, for example.
Oh, perfect example.
Nobody's literally kicking a bucket when they say that, right?
Yeah, that means to die, which
Yeah.
is a lot less literal. But I get how idioms can be confusing if you haven't grown up hearing them.
Yeah, absolutely. They often reflect these like cultural nuances and humor, and they can make your English sound more, colorful and authentic. So like the article uses the example break a leg, which means good luck.
Oh, yeah.
But can you imagine a non-native speaker hearing that for the first time?
Oh, I can only imagine the misunderstandings.
Right. It'd be hilarious. And the article also points out that even within English, there are these variations. So like American idioms can be different from British idioms.
Ah. So it's not just about learning the idioms, it's about knowing which ones to use with who.
Exactly. Exactly. So in the US, for example, you might say to toot your own horn, if you're bragging about something.
Right.
But in the UK, you'd say to blow your own trumpet to mean the same thing.
Interesting. So you really have to be aware of who you're talking to. Like, it's not enough to just learn the idioms. You have to, like, know when and where to use them.
Yeah, it's that cultural awareness piece,
Mm-hmm. This makes me wonder, do you have any favorite idioms you've picked up from, like, other languages?
That's a good question. Let me think. Oh, one comes to mind. It's from German. It's to have tomatoes on your eyes.
Tomatoes on your eyes. What does that mean?
So it means to be like oblivious, to
Mhm.
not notice something that's really obvious.
I love that. It's so visual. It's like
Yeah.
I can picture it.
Right. And that's part of what makes idioms so tricky, but also so fun. It's like they paint these little pictures in your mind.
Okay, so idioms are clearly important. But the article also talks about vocabulary, right?
Mm.
And it's not just about knowing a lot of words. It's about being able to use the right word at the right time.
Exactly. It's about that precision
Yeah.
and nuance. So the article suggests this little challenge. It says to like try to replace those generic intensifiers like very and really,
Oh, yeah.
Try to use more specific words instead. So like instead of very lucky, you could say fortunate, or instead of very good, you could say exceptional.
Oh, I like that.
And instead of very interesting, you could use intriguing.
Ooh, yes. Those little tweaks really elevate your English.
Totally. It shows you have a deeper grasp of the language,
Now, there's this really interesting concept in the article. It's called learning in chunks. And it basically says that our brains don't just memorize individual words. We learn whole phrases.
Right.
Why does that happen?
Right. Well, it's pretty fascinating, actually. Our brains are kind of wired for efficiency. So instead of like processing every single word individually, we group them into these meaningful chunks, Think about it. When you hear someone speaking, you don't hear like, I then went, then to, then the, then store.
Right.
You hear, I went to the store as this one unit of meaning.
That's so true.
So yeah, it's like you're learning these shortcuts for fluency.
I like that.
It's not about like memorizing a big list of words. It's about absorbing these like pre-packaged expressions.
Interesting. This is making me rethink how I approach like learning new vocabulary. It's not just about brute force memorization.
No.
It's about understanding the context and how words relate to each other.
Exactly. And that's actually where the next point in the article comes in, choosing a dialect.
Oh, right. Accents.
Yeah.
I know this is a big one for a lot of English learners.
Yeah.
Like, should you try to sound like a specific kind of English speaker?
Mm.
American, British?
Right. Well, the article says it kind of depends on your situation. If you're constantly interacting with, say, British speakers, then focusing on that dialect might make sense. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with keeping your own accent as long as people can understand you.
Right, and I actually think a slight accent can be kind of charming.
Oh, yeah, me too.
The article even says that research has shown a foreign accent doesn't actually affect your credibility.
Yeah, it's more about confidence and clarity. If you're speaking clearly and engaging with your audience, a little accent often adds personality.
For sure. And speaking of personality, the article makes this connection between language fluency and cultural fluency.
Oh, right.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So imagine like you're watching a British comedy show, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you understand all the individual words, but you're not familiar with British culture.
Mm.
The humor might completely go over your head.
Because you're missing the context.
Exactly. Like there's that saying, right? Language is the mirror of culture.
Oh, yeah. I like that.
To truly master a language, I think you need to like dive into the cultural context. The slang, pop culture references, even like literature and film, it's all connected.
So the article is saying that someone who wants to get better at British English, for example, should really immerse themselves in British culture.
Mm-hmm.
What are some ways to do that besides actually living there?
Well, you could watch British TV shows, you could listen to British music.
Read British authors.
Yeah, even follow British news outlets, social media personalities.
It's about surrounding yourself with it in all its forms.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key piece of the puzzle, slang.
Oh boy, slang.
Slang. I know, right?
It changes so fast, it feels like you can never keep up.
It does, but it's so crucial for sounding natural and for like connecting with native speakers on a more informal level.
So how do you even approach learning slang if it's always changing?
Right. Well, the article recommends learning both local slang, so stuff that's specific to, a region or city, and global slang, which is used more widely.
Yes.
Especially online.
It also mentions that online slang is like bleeding more and more into spoken English.
Oh, for sure.
I'm thinking of things like, LOL, OMG.
Yeah, that shows how language is constantly evolving, and digital communication is playing a huge role in that.
So we've covered idioms, vocabulary, learning in chunks, accents, and slang. What else is in the article?
Well, it also suggests using entertainment as a learning tool, so like movies, TV shows.
Oh, that's a fun one. It's like learning without even realizing you're learning.
Exactly. And you can like pick up all sorts of vocabulary and expressions just by watching and listening.
I'm a big fan of using subtitles strategically, too. Sometimes I'll turn them on to, like, help me connect the words I'm hearing with how they're written. And sometimes I turn them off so I can really focus on the pronunciation.
Yeah, that's a great way to personalize your learning. The key is to find content that you actually enjoy, so, it doesn't feel like work.
Makes sense. And speaking of working on your pronunciation, the article mentions this idea of the imitation game.
Right. So this is about consciously imitating the speech patterns of native speakers you admire. Listen to their rhythm, their intonation, the way they emphasize certain words.
It's like having a personal pronunciation coach, but, without the price tag.
Exactly. And the article even suggests listening to audiobooks, like celebrities reading their own autobiographies.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, like, if you listen to Matthew McConaughey reading Green Lights, you're not only getting insights into his life, but you're also hearing his distinctive Texas accent.
That's a great example. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What would you say is the final takeaway from the article, like the big picture message?
I'd say it all comes down to this. The absolute best way to become fluent in spoken English is through consistent, real-world practice. Ideally through, like, full immersion.
That makes sense. It's like learning to swim, right?
Yeah.
You can read all the books and watch all the videos, but until you actually jump in the pool,
Right.
you're not really going to learn.
Exactly. Living, working, or studying in an English-speaking environment is the most effective way to really immerse yourself. And the article recommends, like, at least 6 months abroad for optimal results.
6 months. That's quite a commitment, though. What about people who can't just, like, pick up and move to another country?
Yeah. Well, there are still plenty of ways to create those immersive experiences right where you are.
Ah, okay. So like little hacks and tricks to make it feel like you're immersed, even if you're not physically in an English-speaking country? I
Exactly.
like that.
Yeah.
Well, we should definitely dig into those in the next part of our deep dive. But before we do that, I'm curious, from this first section of the article, was there anything that like really stood out to you or that you found particularly insightful?
You know, what really resonated with me was that emphasis on natural communication
Hmm.
over absolute perfection. It's not about sounding like a robot. It's
Right.
about connecting with other people in a genuine and authentic way.
I love that. It takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
It's not about achieving this like unattainable ideal of like perfect English.
Mm.
It's about using language as this tool to build relationships and share experiences.
Beautifully said. And that's something everyone can strive for, regardless of their current level.
Absolutely. So we'll be right back after a quick break to talk about those practical ways to create immersive English experiences in your everyday life.
Sounds good.
So before the break, we were talking about immersion, right? And how living abroad isn't the only way to get that experience.
Mm. Right. You can create immersive experiences right where you are, like by making small but consistent changes to how you interact with English every day.
Okay, so the article doesn't really go into a ton of detail here. So I'm curious to hear, like, what would you recommend? What are some specific things people can do?
Well, think about how much time you spend on your devices, right? Phone, computer, tablet.
Oh, yeah.
Simply changing the language settings to English can make a huge difference.
That's so simple. I never even thought about that.
Yeah, suddenly you're navigating menus, reading notifications, even playing games, all in English. It's like
Yeah.
constant low-key exposure.
It's like you're tricking your brain into thinking you're in an English-speaking country.
Exactly. And it's not just about passive exposure either. What about the media you consume for fun? We talked about TV shows and movies, but books, podcasts, even music, those can all become part of your immersion strategy.
I bet listening to the deep dive is fantastic English practice.
It certainly can be. The diverse topics and, conversational style, it can expose you to a wide range of vocabulary and expressions.
Okay, so we've got our devices in English, we're watching shows, listening to podcasts. What else can we do, like, to really create that immersive environment?
Think about your hobbies and interests. Is there a way to experience them through the lens of English?
Yeah. Hmm.
So if you love cooking, for example, you could try finding recipes in English or, watching cooking shows from English-speaking
Oh,
countries.
that's a good idea. Or if you're into fitness, you could follow like English-speaking fitness influencers or join like online workout classes that are taught in English.
Exactly. The key is to find ways to make it fun and relevant to your life.
This makes me think about how like the learning process itself could be so much more enjoyable when you're actually engaged with the material. It's not just about studying, it's about experiencing the language in a way that feels like natural and interesting.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the importance of actually speaking English. Even if you don't live in an English-speaking country, there are still ways to get that real-life practice.
So, like, what would you suggest for someone who wants to practice speaking, but, maybe they don't have a lot of native speakers around them?
Well, a lot of cities have language exchange groups that, meet up in person.
Yeah.
And there are tons of online platforms where you can connect with other English learners or native speakers for conversation practice.
Yeah. I've heard great things about those language exchange platforms. It's like
Yeah.
a win-win, right? Because you're helping someone learn your native language and they're helping you with English.
Exactly. And remember, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Everyone stumbles when they're learning a new language. It's part of the process.
That's such an important reminder because sometimes I think that fear of making mistakes can really hold people back.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But the more you practice speaking, the more comfortable and confident you'll become. It's like any skill, right? The more
Mhm.
you do it, the better you get.
It's so true. And I think this whole conversation is reminding me that, like, fluency is an ongoing journey, not a destination. You're constantly learning and evolving.
Absolutely. It's about continuous growth and improvement, not about reaching some mythical state of perfection.
Yes. And it's important to, like, celebrate your progress along the way.
For sure. Acknowledge your achievements, no matter how small they may seem. Every step forward is a victory.
Love that. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. Let's recap those 10 key steps that the article highlighted. for speaking English fluently. So number one, what was that again?
Using idioms, remember those colorful expressions we talked about, they really add personality and authenticity to your English.
Yes. And number two was making sure you're using the right idioms in the right context, right?
Hmm.
Because, American English versus British English, they can have totally different idioms for the same idea.
Right. Number three was all about expanding your vocabulary.
And number four was learning in chunks. Remembering that our brains, they tend to learn whole phrases rather than just individual words.
Hmm. Five is about choosing a dialect to emulate if you want to. But also, like, knowing that keeping your own accent is perfectly fine as long as you're clear and understandable.
Right? Number six was about understanding that language fluency is tied to cultural fluency.
Right. Seven was all about mastering slang, both local and global.
Eight was about using entertainment things like movies and TV shows as a learning tool.
Hmm. Nine was that imitation game, where you consciously, imitate the speech patterns of native speakers you admire.
And 10. The final and perhaps most important step was immersing yourself in the language as much as possible, whether that's through travel or by creating those immersive experiences in your own life.
Right. Those are some really fantastic tips. But I think it's also important to remember that, like, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
What works for one person might not work for another. It's all about finding the strategies that resonate with you and that fit your learning style.
Exactly. And it should be fun. Like, learning a new language should be an enjoyable experience, not a chore.
Well said. So before we wrap up this episode, I'm curious, is there anything else from the article or from our conversation today that really stood out to you?
One thing that struck me was the article's emphasis on consistency. It's not about cramming for a test or trying to, like, learn everything at once.
Hmm.
It's about making small, steady progress over time.
That makes sense. It's like building a muscle, right?
Right.
You wouldn't expect to get ripped after one workout.
Exactly. It takes consistent effort and dedication.
I love that analogy. It's
Mm.
about finding those ways to, like, make English a natural part of your world,
Yeah.
not just something you study in isolation.
And remember, like, even small actions can have a big impact over time. Whether it's reading an article in English every day, listening to an English podcast during your commute, or even just changing the language settings on your phone, those little things add up.
Those are such good points. So as we move into our final thoughts here, what's one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember from this episode?
I'd say this. Fluency in spoken English is an achievable goal for anyone willing to put in the effort and embrace the process.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not about achieving some, like, unattainable ideal of perfection. It's about communicating effectively, connecting with others, and expressing yourself confidently.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into English fluency, let's leave our listener with a final, thought-provoking question.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into English fluency, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about idioms, slang, immersion, finding a learning style that works for you.
Yeah, it's not just about the textbook stuff, right? It's
Mhm.
about understanding the culture, finding ways to use English that feel natural, like making it a part of your life.
Exactly. And, I feel like even we learned something new today. It's been great to revisit all these concepts, hear your perspective.
I agree. It's a good reminder that even for us, people who work with language all the time, there's always more to learn.
That's so true. Okay, you mentioned leaving our listener with a final question, something to really think about. What is it?
Well, we talked a lot about immersion, and this article is really big on spending time in an English-speaking place. But of course, not everyone can just move to another country, right?
Right.
So my question is, what's one small thing you can do today, right now, to use more English, even if you can't travel?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, what can people do? It can be as simple as, like, changing your phone's language settings
Mm,
or listening to an English podcast on your commute.
exactly. Or even just having a quick chat with a friend or colleague in English.
Right, it's about those small opportunities. It doesn't have to be this big dramatic change.
And even if it's just for a few minutes each day, those minutes add up. It's about making English a regular habit.
I love that. So, to everyone listening, whether you're just starting out or you're already pretty fluent, remember, fluency is a process. It's not like you reach this finish line and you're done. It's about constantly growing, learning, connecting with people.
Embrace the journey, celebrate how far you've come. And don't stop exploring. English is a fascinating language.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you got some good ideas to keep improving your English.
Yeah, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep those conversations going.